In early May 1978, two men struggled up the side of the world's tallest mountain. Peter Habler and Reinhold Messner had been on Mount Everest for several weeks already, slowly acclimating to the altitude as they moved up the mountain from base camp. For several days, they climbed thousands of vertical meters, going ever higher. By May 8th, they were at nearly 8,000 meters, and the air was so thin that even when they managed to sleep, they were regularly awoken by their lungs gasping for air. And they wouldn't be getting any more oxygen until they finished their grueling journey, because these two were trying to become the first people to climb Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen. As the highest mountain in the world, at 8,848 meters, Everest presents an incredible challenge to mountaineers. Not only do they face avalanches, hidden crevasses, and sudden storms, they also have to conquer the death zone. This is the name for the part of the mountain above 8,000 meters, where effective oxygen is 40% less than at sea level. Messner and Habler were trying to answer a big question. Is it even possible to survive standing on top of the highest mountain in the world without supplemental oxygen? And would it be possible to return without permanent or even fatal brain damage? The morning Messner and Habler made their way through the death zone, they took nearly 2 hours to simply get dressed. They could barely make it more than a few meters before collapsing to catch their breath. They communicated only using hand signals to save every breath. In these conditions, the human body rapidly deteriorates. They were clinging to life, but they pushed on. It took them 8 hours to get to the summit, and there they were capable of only an extremely brief celebration. Then it was time to descend, arguably the most dangerous part of the journey, where climbers are exhausted and mistakes begin to happen. Before he realized what was happening, the snow crumbled beneath Habler, and he slid uncontrollably down, losing much of his gear. His descent back to the South Col near Camp 4 took him just an hour. Messner was able to take it more slowly. His descent took him 1 hour and 45 minutes. And besides painful snow blindness in Messner, they returned unharmed with no permanent damage to their brains. Messner and Habler achieved what certain doctors, specialists, and mountaineers thought to be impossible. And today, only 216 people have ever climbed to the summit of Everest without supplementary oxygen. How do these people manage it? Beyond being arguably insane, are they gifted with some superhuman anatomical quirks that make them more capable of withstanding severe oxygen deprivation? Do they have extra strong muscles or really great blood? Or is their physiology unremarkable? The type of fitness that anyone could achieve with enough time and money and dedication. Can anyone be a world-class mountaineer? What is it that propels the best mountaineers to the highest, most dangerous peaks of our planet? Around 40 to 50 million years ago, the Indian continental plate slammed into the Eurasian plate. This led to the creation of our tallest mountain ranges, and today, Earth is home to 14 mountains that reach heights over 8,000 meters. Climbing them requires spending at least some time in the death zone, and these mountains are all found in just two mountain ranges, the Himalayas and the Karakoram. Compared to the Smoky Mountains of North America, which formed between 450 and 540 million years ago, the Himalayas and the Karakoram ranges are both very young, which means they've had a lot less time for erosion to scrape away at their jagged height. At the top of these mountains, in the death zone, negative 50 degrees Celsius winds can gust over 160 kilometers per hour, and barometric pressure drops to only a third of sea level. And this drop in barometric pressure is what makes it so hard to breathe. The relative oxygen concentration in the atmosphere remains the same up to 110,000 meters at 21%. The problem for humans is that the lower barometric pressure means that the partial pressure of oxygen is lower. There are overall less molecules of gas altogether, and thus less oxygen is being pushed into the lungs by the weight of the atmosphere. So there is effectively less oxygen available for humans to make use of. And that triggers a whole cascade of issues for our bodies. Before even getting to the Everest base camp in Nepal, most climbers spend a bit of time lower down the mountain getting acclimated. That's because the base camp itself is really high, at an altitude of 5,364 meters. People sometimes get acute mountain sickness at just 2,000 meters. So at base camp, you'd definitely be feeling the altitude immediately. That means headaches, fatigue, breathlessness, and changed appetite. Chemoreceptors called carotid bodies detect the decreased amount of oxygen reaching the lungs and brain, triggering the hypoxic ventilatory response. Basically, you start breathing more frequently. This is helpful, but it can only do so much, because your body will also start experiencing symptoms of hyperventilation if you're breathing too much. Hyperventilation creates respiratory alkalosis, a reduction in CO2 that limits how many breaths you can physically take. So your increased rate of breathing won't be able to fully compensate for the lower barometric pressure. So the body must adapt in other ways. To transport more oxygen, the body produces more red blood cells, but this increase in hemoglobin also makes the blood thicker, increasing the risk of heart attacks and strokes from clogged blood vessels. At its worst, this can turn into chronic mountain sickness, with the thickened blood leading to heart failure. If you're not staying at high altitude for extended periods, chronic mountain sickness isn't really a risk. But there are plenty of other risks that come up as you go ever higher up the mountain. Now that Mount Everest has an entire tourism industry, most of the trails are laid out in advance, so people trying to get to the top only have to focus on surviving, not finding their way. And to make this undertaking somewhat less dangerous, a new strategy has been developed: climb high, sleep low. What this means is that instead of going straight up the mountain and spending the night at the highest altitude that you can reach that day, many climbers will go up the trail, then come back down again to sleep. This helps the body acclimate better and stay more well-rested. And that's because the higher you get, the more you're gasping for air. Sleep studies have found that mountaineers at extreme altitudes wake up 30 to 40 times a night and have a 50% reduction in total sleep time. The higher you get, the more you're also at risk of dehydration and muscle wasting, in part because it takes so many calories to do this amount of work, and also because it seems that the GI tract struggles to absorb nutrients at high altitudes. The margin of error becomes smaller and smaller the higher you go, and the hope is that you will not have to spend more than one night in the death zone. Take the case of two climbers who were forced to camp out above 8,500 meters on Mount Everest during their descent because of extreme weather conditions. The first climber faced a frigid temperature of negative 31 degrees Celsius and high winds, while the second one camped in negative 23 degrees Celsius and much gentler winds. The second climber survived, while the first climber ultimately died, and his death was attributed to the greater amount of hypothermic and hypoxic stress. Maybe both would have survived if the weather conditions had been a little gentler, but that's a roll of the dice on Everest. By the time you get to 8,000 meters and above, you're facing the weather as well as the accumulated toll of high altitude. At any moment, you might experience pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, or a heart attack. Like the Everest movie says, human beings are simply not built to function at the cruising altitude of a 747. And yet, we now have hundreds of people attempting to summit Mount Everest and other 8,000ers every year with the aid of supplemental oxygen, and plenty do it successfully. But only about 200 have done it without supplemental oxygen. Are those people endowed with superhuman fitness? To understand the physiological differences of mountaineers versus elite athletes in other endurance sports, researchers have put them both to the test in lab-based experiments to compare them. Take one study from 2015, which compared 11 high-altitude climbers who were not currently in their acclimated phase, and 11 non-climber controls who had similar age, gender, and fitness level. Both groups were asked to perform cycling exercises in both normal oxygen conditions and while wearing a mask that gave them less oxygenated air to breathe. The hypoxic conditions caused reduced exercise performance and oxygen uptake in both groups, with very few differences between them. At most, researchers noted that the climbers changed their breathing patterns, taking slower, deeper breaths during exercise. The researchers concluded that, at least in these settings, there was nothing unique about the climbers' aerobic capacity. One study from the 1980s looked specifically at Reinhold Messner and 5 more climbers who had reached at least one of the 4 highest peaks in the world without supplemental oxygen. To the researchers' surprise, the anaerobic capacity of these climbers also wasn't substantially different from active non-athletes. The only notable difference was that the climbers' muscle capillary density was substantially above normal, but they did not suggest that this accounted for the climbers' success. This is their hilarious conclusion. On the whole, it appears that the main features of a successful elite altitude climber are, besides an optimal functional balance and an unusual skill, strong motivation and exceptional drive. Reinhold Messner is characterized by rather normal physiological features, but by the obsessive need to be the first and the best. So basically, it's not just the climbing distance that these guys are trying to measure and compare, if you know what I mean. But these experiments only looked at their subjects' performance in low oxygen conditions, not high altitude conditions. So in 1985, researchers developed a new test. They put 8 male volunteers in an altitude chamber for 40 days, where barometric pressure would slowly be dropped from sea level, 101 kilopascals, to the summit of Everest, 32 kilopascals. And as this pressure drops, the available oxygen also drops. This would allow researchers to study the limits of human tolerance to chronic hypoxia. What they found was that oxygen transport within the body was a much more limiting factor in high-altitude conditions than they realized. Further speculation surrounding this study says that perhaps Messner and Habler did indeed have an advantage over other athletes, that their oxygen transport was superior. Remember the study from before that found their capillary densities were 40% above normal? This would increase oxygen transport, and thus very well may have been the thing that allowed them to summit Everest with no supplemental oxygen. But in the scheme of things, this is just one relatively small advantage that Messner and Habler made use of. Their physiology was nothing profoundly out of the ordinary. So maybe there is nothing particularly special, physiologically speaking, about the people who set records on Mount Everest. But there is one enormous exception to this, and that is the Sherpa. Though the media and pop culture may have you forget this, white Europeans are not the only ones setting records on the world's highest mountain. Perhaps the most famous of the Sherpa mountaineers is Tenzing Norgay, who became the first to reach the summit of Mount Everest along with Edmund Hillary in 1953. But many more Sherpas have shown their remarkable mountaineering abilities since then, as porters for Western climbers, and more recently as record-setting mountaineers in their own right. Babu Chiri Sherpa stayed on the summit of Everest for a record 21 hours. The average stay is just a few minutes long. Kamirita Sherpa has summited a record 28 times. Lakpa Gelu Sherpa holds the record for the fastest ever ascent from Everest South Base Camp, which he did in just 10 hours and 56 minutes. Average summits from here take 5 to 6 days after acclimating. How do they manage these incredible feats? Based on the archaeological record, humans have been present on the Tibetan Plateau for at least 30,000 years, with permanent settlers appearing between 6,000 and 9,000 years ago. The average elevation is around 4,500 meters, meaning the people who live there are constantly at high altitude. The Sherpa are an ethnic group who left the Tibetan Plateau sometime around 600 years ago and settled in Nepal. They've been regularly studied to show how the human body actually can change and adapt to high altitude, and unlike the temporary acclimatization that some climbers undergo, these changes are permanent. First, there's the fact that Sherpas have lower hemoglobin concentrations at high altitudes. which means they don't risk developing chronic mountain illness, since their blood never gets as thick. Having less oxygen-transporting hemoglobin might seem like a bad thing when dealing with hypoxia, but their bodies make up for this in a number of different ways. Their muscle tissue, for example, is particularly well-suited to hypoxic environments. The Sherpa have a greater number of capillaries transporting their blood, and their mitochondria are more efficient at using oxygen to produce ATP, the energy our cells need to function. But even when they run low on ATP, Sherpas have high levels of phosphocreatine, an energy reserve that helps muscles contract in the absence of ATP. For lowlanders who go to high altitudes, their phosphocreatine levels plummet after a bit of time because their bodies use it up. In the Sherpas, those levels increase at altitude. Sherpas also seem to have a unique way of generating energy. Skeletal muscle can burn either sugars or fat to produce energy, and most of the time our bodies burn fat even though it's inefficient. It's only when we're doing something physically stressful, like exercise, that the body shifts to using sugars for energy. For Sherpas, the muscle seems to prefer carbohydrates, especially in hypoxia, making them extra efficient at producing energy. And lastly, for lowlanders who aren't used to high altitude, the body starts to accumulate free radicals, molecules created by a lack of oxygen that can be very damaging to tissues. But in Sherpas, there is no sudden increase in free radicals. Their bodies handle the reduced oxygen just fine. And this research has applications far beyond just climbing mountains. One of the major challenges for patients in intensive care units who might have heart failure or cancer is the fact that their bodies seem unable to make proper use of oxygen. Even trying to give them extra oxygen doesn't seem to help. Researchers hope that by understanding the Sherpas' adaptations to hypoxia, they may be able to apply those same principles to people whose illnesses cause hypoxic conditions. Unfortunately, the research on Sherpas also means that there's no real way to get your body to adapt to high elevation on turbo speed. It's something that happened over generations, not only to the ethnic Sherpas, but also to other Tibetan and Nepalese populations. And some populations in the Andes also have long-term high-altitude adaptations, though they're slightly different than the physiological changes found in Asian populations. That said, if you really want to get to the top of a high mountain, it is possible. You'll have to spend a lot of time training, a lot of money on travel and gear and guides, and you'll still have a pretty good chance of dying. Honestly, I don't really understand why anyone would ever want to do any of this. But the human body is incredibly resilient, even in the harshest environments. If you're more into the learning about extreme athletic feats than the doing extreme athletic feats, then you're a lot like me. I love learning about the extremes of Mount Everest or the depths of outer space, even if I don't actually want to go there. But these environments are undeniably fascinating, because in extreme places, there's also extreme science. Without an understanding of atmospheric conditions and their effect on the human body, no one would be able to climb to the world's highest peak, or one day travel to the other planets in our solar system. Understanding the complex science of the world is key to unlocking humanity's biggest achievements. And the way I make sure I understand these complex science subjects from the comfort of my own home is by using Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. And Brilliant for me works better than any other learning tool, better than textbooks or even college lectures, because Brilliant is a learning platform designed to be uniquely effective. They take you step by step through the learning process, helping you build understanding from the ground up. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that sometimes feels more like a game than like learning. This interactivity is proven to be 6 times more effective than watching lecture videos. And it's not just that Brilliant is a helpful memorization tool, it's quite the opposite. Brilliant helps you build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing equations. The new Exploring Data Visually course has been particularly helpful for me to parse and visualize massive datasets to make them easier to interpret. our world is now bursting at the seams with data. And understanding how to interpret and display it is important for anyone's career. And with Brilliant, you get to use real datasets from sources like Starbucks, Twitter, Spotify, and more. And in this era of doom scrolling, Brilliant is something I use to snap myself out of it and do something positive for my personal and professional growth. So to try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/realscience or click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.